The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 30. Toes and Fingers. November 1996. In the middle of November, Richard missed several calls from Lucius on his burner mobile. He had lost the phone for a few days, as it had slipped between the seats in the station wagon. It wasn't until Richard was chasing a dropped lemon sherbet that he found it again. He was shocked to see that he had missed 48 calls, a few of which had voicemails. Lucius had not known how to leave a message, and had started talking as soon as the messaging system answered, so each recording began mid-diatribe.
"Brought along his book, and it's entirely useless. I'm fairly certain this Lockhart wanker never even met a Yeti. The man is a nincompoop, clearly. He talks about their droppings and their mating habits, the unusual calls they make at night. I've heard nothing of the sort. The only sound out there is just snow falling on snow, and wind howling in the trees. It's eerie, I tell you, Richard."
The next message, dated the following day, was more urgent.
"Really don't think I have enough meat to attract one, and the cave I'm staying in is very dark. My wand just can't generate enough light. I'm fairly certain there are animals watching me at night. I suppose I could try and trap them if they are small, and use them for extra meat, but they sound like they're planning something."
The final recording was even more dire.
"And I can hardly feel my hands, Richard. My warming charms are shit out here. I had to kill a mountain lion, and slit him open and sleep inside of his warm body last night. You cannot imagine the feeling of waking up inside the carcass of a cold, dead lion."
Evidently, it had become clear to Lucius that the voice messages weren't getting through, and somehow he had discovered that the phone also had the ability to send written messages. The first one was cryptic.
7424.
Then
7424. Richard, help! And finally, "No Yeti, what do?"
Richard called Lucius immediately. "Lucius? Sorry, mate, I lost my mobile. Are you all right?"
"No,"
Lucius said. His voice sounded very tinny and far away, but the desperation came through just fine.
"I can't feel my toes, and I'm pretty sure there are no Yeti here. I'm not sure what to do."
"Well, why don't you just come home?"
Do you think that's a good idea? The Dark Lord will be so angry."
"Lucius, if you can't feel your toes, they'll have to cut your toes off," Richard began.
"Salazar's anus! Just a moment."
And the call disconnected. Richard hung up, unsure of what had happened. He idly wondered what a salad bar anus was. A few minutes later, the mobile rang again. "Lucius?"
"Yes, I'm home. I've decided that you are right. My toes are worth more than a Yeti."
"Geez, I think you're right." Richard suppressed a laugh. "Tell you what, let me see what I can do." A few days later, when Lucius stopped by, Richard brought in a large shopping bag from the cellar. "I picked this up. I thought it might work out for you."
"What is it?"
Lucius asked warily. "It's a Yeti costume."
"Am I to wear it?"
Lucius asked, in mild horror.
"No, but maybe just have one of the other Death Eaters put it on and walk around at the edge of the forest. You can point him out to the Dark Lord through the window, and he'll think you've captured a Yeti,"
Richard explained. There was a growing sense of pleased excitement on Lucius's face.
"I think I can do even better. I'm fairly certain I can get a dwarf to do it. I'm sure for a small stipend he will actually live out in the forest as the Yeti."
Richard hid his silent but horrified laugh. Some days, he thought, Lucius was far too cunning for his own good. Late November 1996.
Fizzing Wisbees,
Draco said to the gargoyle with only a minimal eye roll. Hermione looked up at him and smiled knowingly. "You like fizzing Wisbees too," she whispered conspiratorially.
Yes, but you don't see me making a password out of it. I'm surprised he doesn't choose something more distinguished, more befitting the office."
It was Hermione's turn to roll her eyes. "When you are headmaster, you choose something befitting the office, all right?" He narrowed his silver eyes at her, but before he could answer they had arrived. They were startled to walk into the room and find not just Dumbledore and Fawkes, but Richard Granger, Professor Snape, and their old Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, Remus Lupin. Hermione ran swiftly to her father, throwing her arms around him in a fierce hug. "Dad! What are you doing here?" she asked, struggling to keep the tears from her voice.
"In due time, Crabcake," he murmured to her. To both of them he said, "Let us all sit down and listen to what Professor Dumbledore has to say."
The group settled into magically conjured chairs, and Dumbledore began.
"Well, it's actually Mr. Malfoy and Miss Granger who need to explain what is going on. Would the two of you mind letting everyone know what happened this summer?"
Hermione looked down, suddenly afraid to speak. It had been hard enough explaining what was going on to Professor Dumbledore. To tell her father now that she had been tasked with murder seemed impossible. She cut her eyes right to Draco, who appeared to be focusing on winding his fingers together as tightly as he could, the same paralysis of the tongue affecting him as well.
"Perhaps I can be of some assistance, Professor."
The smooth tones of Severus Snape cut into the silence. All eyes turned swiftly to him in surprise, with the exception of Albus Dumbledore's.
"You see, I am not only a member of the Order of the Phoenix, but I still serve at the side of the Dark Lord."
At this proclamation, Professor Lupin jumped to his feet. "Dumbledore, what is the meaning of—"
"Please, Remus, don't interrupt. This is important," Dumbledore said mildly. "I have known that Severus still meets with Voldemort, still maintains the pretense of serving him. He has been the source of valuable information in the past. Without his help, Hogwarts and its inhabitants would have been in far greater danger several times over these many years."
"But if he's giving information to Voldemort—"
"The information I give the Dark Lord is generally only mildly helpful to him, at best. And all of it is discussed with Dumbledore before I give it. I have worked hard to maintain my facade, and I have no intent for that to change, Lupin. You, of all people, understand the need to maintain a facade."
Snape sneered at him. Draco and Hermione exchanged curious glances. What was all this about? Lupin sat down, tight-lipped, but still clearly angered. Once Snape was assured of everyone's silence and attention, he resumed.
"As I was saying, perhaps I can shed some light upon the subject. This summer I was told in confidence by the Dark Lord that he was giving the task of killing Albus Dumbledore to Mr. Malfoy and Miss Granger."
There was a gasp from both Professor Lupin and Hermione's father.
"As for the two of you, I can tell you this."
Snape turned to the students.
"He does not intend for you to succeed. He knows that it will prove to be nearly impossible. Not just because murder is actually quite difficult to bring oneself to do, but also because he knows Dumbledore to be an extremely powerful wizard. He is certain that Dumbledore will be forced to kill the two of you. Then he will be free to punish your parents as punishment for your failures."
Hermione began breathing very fast, hyperventilating. Draco's own heart was racing double time, but he reached out a hand to hold hers in comfort. Her tearful copper eyes met his silver ones. Reluctantly, she looked at her father. "Why is he out to kill them?" Hermione whispered in disbelief. It was Snape who answered. "I believe the Dark Lord still holds animosity towards Lucius for losing the diary and the prophecy. As for your father—" Snape raised an eyebrow as though the answer were obvious. Dumbledore cut in. "I believe Voldemort feels that Richard is an interloper and a threat to his organization."
"Yes," Snape drawled. "He certainly feels threatened by your father." He added something under his breath that sounded vaguely like "we all do."
"Dad, say something," Hermione pleaded. Richard seemed to struggle to find his voice. Finally he said, "Not to worry, Crabcake. We're going to figure this out." And so the six of them began going over ideas, discussing possibilities, and reviewing what they knew. Hermione occasionally had to pinch herself when she realized what seemed to be happening. Her father, an easy-going dentist by trade, was discussing tactics as though he was conversing about the weather. It seemed surreal to hear him talk about safe houses and counter-curses. Dumbledore cleared his throat. "It is getting late. Curfew starts soon. Perhaps Miss Granger and Mr. Malfoy can leave us and go back to their common rooms. Let us plan to meet again next week. Say Wednesday night at 8. Everyone nodded, and the two students rose to leave. Dumbledore spoke up again. "I wish to thank both of you for trusting me with this information, and not feeling as though you needed to keep it all to yourselves. It takes a great deal of courage to ask for help. But rest assured, as I've told my students before, help will always be given at Hogwarts to those who ask for it." Draco and Hermione nodded and turned to go. Richard rose to say goodbye to his daughter with a strong hug and a quick handshake for Draco. They climbed the stairs for Gryffindor Tower, their fingers interlaced. When they reached the little space that Hermione thought of as their alcove, she stopped and turned to him. "Thank you for coming with me tonight. I know it was hard to have all of that said aloud."
"I only hope your father doesn't think less of me,"
he murmured into her hair. "Draco," she drawled.
"What is it?"
he asked, tilting his head to look at her quizzically. She looked up at him with a fiery gaze. "I don't want to talk about my father right now." She cocked one eyebrow at him suggestively. A flush rose up his neck, then his cheeks. "Oh," he said. They checked that the coast was clear and ducked into the alcove. After all, they still had about 20 minutes until curfew. When they emerged several minutes later, Hermione checking the buttons on her blouse, they shared one last kiss goodnight, and hurried for their respective common rooms. For the first time, sixth year felt like it should have for both of them this whole time, full of possibility, with a silver lining of hope bursting from behind a cloud of despair. The four men waited until the door with the griffin knocker snickered closed behind Hermione and Draco. Then they turned to look at each other in uncertain silence. "What do you make of this? Why would he ask the two of them together?" Richard asked the group at large. "It is a test, certainly," said Dumbledore, Perhaps it is a test of yours and Lucius's loyalty to him. Or perhaps it is simply a way of getting Hermione out of the picture. Does he have any idea that Lucius believes Hermione is his?" "I don't believe so, and it isn't my intention to let him know that. I've never asked Lucius not to discuss it with him, but I have a feeling that if he did, Voldemort would come out of the conversation more confused than he went in. Lucius has a tendency to muddy the waters." "Yes, I remember his Transfigurations assignments over the years." Dumbledore chuckled. "So, what are we going to do, really?" Richard asked. "I realize you didn't want to get into details with the children here, but I know you don't honestly expect one of them to kill you." Dumbledore sighed, shaking free his robe from his right hand, which until now he had covered discreetly. "No, I do not wish that. It would be too much of a burden for either of them to bear. However, it is certain that my days are numbered anyway." Remus and Richard recoiled in horror at the sight of the blackened hand. "Dumbledore, what happened?" Remus asked. "An unfortunate encounter with a cursed object. Very foolish, quite stupid of me. Severus here managed to contain the dark magic to one hand. However, with time, even that will not suffice. Eventually, the dark magic will spread and overtake me. I have less than a year, we think." The tense set of Snape's jaw gave away nothing but displeasure. Remus eyed him carefully. "You did all you could." "You care to try for yourself?" Snape challenged. "Yes, I did all I could, considering that Dumbledore waited several minutes before calling me. You should know that many students have commented that I am the best defense against the dark arts teacher they've had yet." "Let me guess," sneered Remus. "All of those students wear green." Snape sneered back. He opened his mouth to reply, but both of the men were immediately silenced as Dumbledore raised his blackened hand. "Gentlemen, I welcome both your help in this regard. However, I must accept that my days are few. I do not wish for our time spent together to be marred by bickering." The two men nodded curtly at each other, an unspoken understanding to maintain peace. "Now then," but Dumbledore was interrupted yet again, this time by Richard Granger. "Professor, I hope you don't mind me asking something." "Not at all, sir, and please call me Albus." "All right, Albus. I was just wondering, have you ever considered debridement?" Richard asked. All three of the men looked at each other and at him in confusion. "I have never married," Dumbledore explained kindly. No, sorry," Richard chuckled. "It's a surgical procedure. A doctor removes the dead, diseased tissue, leaving the healthy tissue to thrive. We have to do it occasionally in my dental practice." "I'm afraid that any kind of injury caused by dark magic cannot be fully removed," Dumbledore said, though he sounded more uncertain now. "I realize you can't remove it magically, but perhaps there is a Muggle method. Would you be willing to try it?" "That depends," said Dumbledore, with uncertainty. "Would you be willing to perform the procedure?" "Ah, geez," Richard said. "I'm certain there are far more qualified surgeons than me that you would rather have." "Ah, but you see, I trust you to do it." Richard was silent for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Well, okay then. I would be honored." He swallowed a bit nervously. "I'm going to need some help, though." Remus spoke up. "I'm sure that Severus and I will make capable assistance," he said, looking across the table at Snape, who nodded in agreement.
"When can we do this? It should be as soon as possible," Snape said. "The dark magic creeps out little by little every day. In another month it will move past his wrist."
"What sort of charms did you use to contain it?" Remus asked Snape, studying Dumbledore's hand interestedly. It was a question born of curiosity, not of challenge. That much was clear from Remus's tone.
"I did a localized stasis charm, followed by continuous healing chants and repelling charms, in order to push the magic into his extremity," Snape said, pointing at the dark hand.
"And the furthest it would go was his hand?" Remus said, brow furrowing in concentration.
"Yes and no," Snape said. "I could make it shrink down to only the index finger, as that was the finger with which he touched the object. But I could not get it to stay in only that finger. As soon as the stasis charm faded, it moved back into the rest of his hand, and each time it moved further and further out from the initial injury. I finally realized that the dark magic was fighting back, making it progress faster, so I stopped trying to reduce it and focused on containment instead."
Remus said, lost in thought. "What if—" But he broke off, still considering. He tilted his head from side to side, as though trying to look for different angles on the problem.
"What are you thinking, Lobo?"
Richard asked. "I'm only wondering, if Severus were to push the dark magic temporarily into only that finger, and simultaneously I were to do a stasis charm, and someone else a severing charm, and then you did the divinement—"
"Debridement,"
Richard said, nodding along with his words. "Yes, that. Well, do you think that perhaps Dumbledore might only need to lose that finger?" Richard asked the others excitedly. For once, Snape's expression was not hardened into a mask of indifference. He seemed genuinely interested in what Remus had to say.
"Perhaps it could work."
"And, at worst, what would happen? Dumbledore loses a bit more wrist if the magic fights back, and we try the same procedure from that point. In the end, perhaps it is worth trying." Remus was excited now. Snape nodded vigorously.
"I say we try this as soon as possible." He turned to Richard. "Today is Wednesday. When can you come back? I'd like to have a day or so to brew a few intensive pain relief potions, but I can be ready as early as Friday evening."
Richard looked at them regretfully.
"Unfortunately, we're going to my in-laws for the weekend. Believe me, I would rather be here cutting off your hand, Albus."
Professor Dumbledore snorted behind his blackened hand.
"Monday night, then?" asked Snape.
I'm afraid Monday won't be the best for me. I will be, indisposed that evening."
"Ah, yes," Snape said snidely. "We would all rather you stay in your home that day as well. You must maintain your facade, we know."
Richard cut in.
"Sorry if this seems rude to ask, Professor Snape, but what problem do you have with my friend Remus here? I've known this man for almost 9 years, and he's been nothing but unfailingly polite and professional in that time. What gives?"
Richard's generally affable demeanour had a slightly hardened edge. "Mouse, please, it's all right. Professor Snape and I were in school together, and some old hurts run deep."
"But what's this guff about maintaining a facade? I realize I didn't know you were a wizard all those years, but surely he knew."
"There's more to it than that." Remus interjected in a ragged voice. There's something else I've never told you about myself. Something I usually try to keep under wraps. However, seeing as Professor Snape has been kind enough these last 3 years to brew a particular potion for me, he's known my secret for quite some time."
"Lobo, you don't have to reveal anything,"
Richard cut in, but Remus stopped him. "I know I don't. But as a trusted colleague and a friend, you deserve to know in case anything were to happen in the future. When I was a young boy, I was bitten by a werewolf at the full moon. Since that awful day, every month at the full moon, I transform into a werewolf." "Ah, jeez," Richard whispered to himself. "Indeed," agreed Remus. "For the past couple of years, Severus has been kind enough to brew the potion that allows me to transform into a regular wolf instead of a werewolf every month. However, I am still unable to speak or to perform magic during the time of the full moon."
Richard nodded.
"Can we do this Tuesday night?" Remus asked the others.
Everyone nodded. 8 o'clock again, then," Dumbledore said.
Richard shook hands with each of the men. Then he turned back to Remus.
"You know, Lobo, this explains a lot. Like how you always know how to get where we're going, but you're seldom on time."
Remus smiled, knowing there was a joke coming, but not knowing what the punchline was. "How so?"
"Well, because you're a werewolf, not a win-wolf."
From behind the two of them came an exaggerated, long-suffering sigh.
"As we have reached the witticism portion of the evening, that is my cue to leave. I have essays to grade."
Snape moved swiftly to the door.
Richard called after him, "Sounds charming. Watch out for spelling errors."
Snape stopped, but did not turn, his hand on the doorknob, white-knuckled, gripping it tightly. Richard could not leave well enough alone.
"You know, spelling errors."
Snape threw open the door, causing it to bang into the wall, as he hurried swiftly out.
"Ah, jeez. That bloke could use an anger management course,"
Richard said, turning back to Lupin and Dumbledore.
"He already knows how to anger the management,"
Dumbledore said with a kindly smile.
Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Muggle Death Eater by Great 78.